everybody. Welcome to single-use plastics and waste in medical and laboratory research. We are going to expect a lot from you because this is a highly interactive session. We have very limited speaking on our part and lots of questions and lots of engagement, we hope, because we really want everybody to leave feeling inspired, feeling like having lots of questions in their own minds about single-use plastics and waste in their individual spaces. So let's kick it off. I'm good off the cuff at lunch, but when it comes to this, I need my notes. So thank you all for joining us. Again, we're hoping for a really interactive and thought-provoking discussion about the impacts and frankly the ethics of the overprevalence of single-use plastics in the medical and research laboratory fields. I'm Leana the Waste Reduction and Recycling Manager in the Johns Hopkins Office of Sustainability. Only a few decades ago, medical and lab supplies were made of reusable metal, cloth, and glass with little to no plastic used in their construction or packaging and sterilized before each reuse. Now, virtually every piece of equipment, as such as surgical masks, syringes, and surgical tools, as well as pipettes, test tubes, growth flasks, are wrapped in or composed of plastic. The production, transport, use, and disposal of these items are responsible for around 80% of the healthcare industry's carbon footprint, which accounts for 8.5% of the US greenhouse emissions and 85% of global healthcare waste. While the medical and research fields are essential to improving and maintaining our health and advancing our society, and some amount of biohazard material cannot or should not be reduced or recycled, our current practice of relying almost exclusively on single-use plastics is contributing to environmental degradation and serious threats to public health globally and locally, particularly in marginalized communities and communities of color. With us today to share their knowledge of ethical and practical challenges of single-use plastics and the feasibility and cultural shift needed to return to reusable supplies and reducing the reliance on single-use supplies are on Zoom, Jeremy Greene, MD, PhD, MA, and the William H. Welch Professor of Medicine and the History of Medicine at Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine, Mariah W. Merritt, PhD and Associate Professor at the Johns Hopkins Berman Institute of Bioethics and Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, Department of International Health, who together with Caroline Skolnick wrote the article, How Medicine Becomes Trash, Disposability in Healthcare, published in Lancet October 2022, that inspired this panel session, and as well as Brian Weeks, PhD and Green Lab Specialist in the Johns Hopkins University Office of Sustainability. We hope that you will leave today empowered to face these challenges in your own medical and research spaces. So let's start with a few words from you, Jeremy, about the article you and Mariah co-wrote, The History of Waste in the Medical Field and the Myth that Disposable is Safer.
Thanks so much for this introduction. I'm delighted to be here today. Wish I could be there in person. It just seems like such an amazing series of panels today. I'm delighted that JHU is taking this issue of sustainability on in so many different streams across different parts of our university. I'm a physician. I practice internal medicine, primary care internal medicine in a community health center in East Baltimore Medical Center. And I'm also a historian. So I've over the years become a historian, pretty much of medical technologies. My first few books have been on the history of pharmaceutical knowledge making and pharmaceutical marketing. My most recent book is a history of what kinds of practices get built into electronic modes of doing medical practice or sort of virtual presence. And I think one of the things a historian, I try and reconcile these two identities as a clinician and a historian by asking, well, what are questions of things that we have come to take for granted in our everyday lives, especially in the field of healthcare, that when you use some of the tools of a historian become rapidly denaturalized, and the sort of assumptions that we build into our lives actually show many other paths not taken. And, in the past few years, the amount of trash that I throw out in my clinic because it involves using devices that used to be reusable that are now disposable has actually been increasing. And it just struck me as this real discordance at this moment that so many different sectors of the economy and even different parts of life here at Johns Hopkins, as evidenced by you today, have been focusing on sustainability. How is it that the vector of disposability, of not a circular economy of goods, but a linear economy of goods, is actually accelerating? And COVID really brought that home to so many of us, that the amount of trash generated by discardable masks, we came to see disposable masks or even disposable diagnostics, like COVID testing kits becoming commonplace objects in gutters and streetscapes. So, you go back to the 1960s and, most of these things are reusable. Syringes are not made of of plastic. They're made of glass. They are recycled in autoclaves. There's a lot of investment in sterilizing and reusing technologies that are part of the visible plant of a medical center or of a research hub. And even in my own clinic, even in the relatively short time that I've been practicing this past decade there, we've gone from having reusable, for example, forceps or, scissors, for a suture, retraction. The minor surgical procedures that I did one last week and just produced a small mountain of waste that we had to actually throw out. So trying to understand, how is it that we've come to accept disposability as something necessary to protect ourselves? And granted, there are some cases in which the disposable glove, for example, it's hard to make the case that every time someone uses a glove in medical practice, they really should go and wash it and sterilize it and then reuse that glove. There may be some things where the actual cost benefit for disposability is still substantial. But for example, the vaginal speculum for a routine pelvic exam, which was a reusable object when I started out, the light source for it, which was a reusable object, now is a single piece of plastic with an LED light source and a rare earth battery built into it, which is used once and then tossed away. So, as a historian, I found myself in conversation with Mariah, a moral philosopher in the School of Public Health, and trying to understand, why have we come up with these dichotomies where it appears that one needs disposability in order to have safety in healthcare, or needs disposability in order to have effective regimens in healthcare. But in truth, we find that we've just created a bracket around medical waste, and we just assume that medical waste needs to be massive, needs to be disposable, needs to be single use, needs to be plastic intensive, and haven't bothered to ask, well, what other way might we do it? And as a historian, in a way, there are a lot of other ways that we used to do it that actually offer alternate paths forward that are really not on the table right now. Not even really part of what the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine are talking about when they talk about plans to decarbonize the healthcare sector. So how do we move beyond the fungibility? Because all carbon is not all carbon, right? Plastic either gets incinerated and produce dioxins, right? If causing differential exposure along terms of environmental justice here in Baltimore, among other places, or it winds up in the ocean, right? So what happens with these things that are designed to be used only once means more than just a carbon footprint. So with that, I'm gonna sort of see if I can pass this along. I don't know where my hands are. Let's see. This hand. Yeah. To Mariah.
Thank you, Jeremy. And I hope that we'll have time to hear a little bit more about that narrative of disposability and what's safer and what's just, the way we need to do things, and how we came about that narrative and some of that, history of medicine that you've shared with us in so many really wonderful conversations that Jeremy and Mariah and Ryan and I had. And we figured if no one showed up, we would just sit and continue the conversation that we've had like 3 or 4 times. It's been fantastic. So I'm gonna turn it over to Mariah. So as a professor in the Berman Institute of Bioethics, I'd love to hear you speak specifically to the question of ethics and the paradoxical nature of healthcare's oversized waste and carbon footprint.
Great. I'll stand up so people can hear me. Thank you very much, Leana. So I'm going to start from a different starting point and come back to pretty much to where Jeremy left off. And my first point to make is ethics really is the study of how to live a good life. And I found myself about 2 years ago on sabbatical living in Victoria, British Columbia, where there had just been wildfires in other parts of British Columbia. There had been this incredible heat dome over Victoria. Then as the fall went on, there were these atmospheric rivers that drenched everything. And probably like many people these days, we experience the impacts of climate change more personally, more directly than ever before, and it can get you kind of down. And I picked up a book in the bookstore about climate anxiety, and one thing that I learned from it is like the most therapeutic thing is to get involved where you are, raise your voice where you are. And so I said to myself, well, I'm in the health systems program in the School of Public Health, and I'm now becoming aware of this massive global effort to decarbonize health systems. And so that's where I set out to locate my agenda in public health research and practice. And I do find that it is fantastic. The more you get involved, the more hope you have. And that's what we need for everyone to be involved and raise your voice where you are. With respect to the ethics, this will be consistent with what you would have heard if you went to the clinical care and sustainability panel this morning. How many people went to that? Anyone? Yeah, okay. So a prime directive in healthcare is do no harm. Well, climate change has health impacts, and the healthcare sector contributes to the health impacts of climate change just through its contribution to greenhouse gas emissions. I'll briefly reiterate some of the health impacts of climate change that come from extreme weather, heat stress, infectious disease, food insecurity, mental health. And what's worse is that the people least responsible for climate change are the most at risk of harm. Secondly, fossil fuel use not only propels climate change, but also has direct impacts on health right now. In 2020, worldwide, there were 1.2 million premature deaths from air pollution attributable to fossil fuel combustion specifically. Now, those are impacts that we can reduce very quickly by moving off of fossil fuels. And not only can the health sector reduce its contribution to the impacts of climate change and to the direct impacts of fossil fuel use, but the health sector has a voice too. There are so many health professionals, and the main talking points in the fossil fuel industry have shifted from it's not really happening, it's not our fault, it's not that bad, to okay, it's happening and we're part of the transition. Don't worry, be happy, we got this covered. We just need to squeeze out a few more profits, but like, you know, don't worry, the transition is inevitable, we'll get there. And the healthcare community needs to say to our legislators and administration officials in local, state, and national governments, no, we cannot afford to delay. We have health impacts right now that we can address that will also have long-term fossil fuel climate benefits. So not only do we need to not delay, we have to accelerate the transition away from fossil fuels, both for the climate benefits, but also to protect health right now and where we live in Baltimore. Stories that healthcare providers can share and stories that community members can share do make a difference when powerful people are deciding what regulations to promulgate or what laws to pass. However, we have to be internally consistent. We can't be going and talking to legislators and submitting public comments to the EPA without being able to answer the question, what are you doing in your own house? How are you in the healthcare sector also reducing your impact? And that's a second ethical argument for doing everything that we can do where we are in our practice. Finally, some ethical questions internal to healthcare now that we're trying to focus on our own house. Going back to where Jeremy left off, we can think about safety, efficacy, efficiency, and equity. And I'll wrap up with these points. From the ethical standpoint, safety is about minimizing the risks of healthcare delivery. Efficacy is about maximizing the clinical benefit of healthcare services. Efficiency is about achieving the greatest health gain for the least cost, other things being equal. And equity is about fairness in the distribution of both the benefits and the burdens. And especially we're interested in health care equity, through which everybody always has access to the highest quality care that we can offer. Some people like to imagine that there are trade-offs, that we can't have safety without trading off some ecological sustainability, or we can't have efficiency without trading it off. We don't know that. We'll have to see, and that's what Jeremy's getting at by talking about these dichotomies that we come to accept. And as a philosopher, I want to question, what are the premises behind those dichotomies? Are they real? How can we mitigate them? And the last point I want to make is, as we talk about potential trade-offs or the idea of trade-offs between sustainability and any of these other values, looking for solutions where we can get a win-win, it's imperative to include the people most affected by the health impacts and by the underlying climate change processes. If we don't include everyone in the conversation, there are many things that can go wrong. First of all, people won't feel respected. They might feel like, well, you're just telling me to do this. How do I know it's really good for me? It's important to demonstrate respect, and it's also important to get better ideas from people than we might have ourselves. So we want to have the conversation be as inclusive as possible. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Mariah. I really appreciate the point that you raised about the voices of the medical community. You know, when the pandemic first started, I mean, we were all rightfully freaking out. And, you know, there was, you know, we weren't even going out anymore. But then once we go back into the world, you know, you were going, and we're always promoting, you know, reuse here, reusing your mugs and those kinds of things. And everyone was, you know, saying, no, we can't reuse things. We have to throw things away. And then, you know, maybe like 8 months into the pandemic, a letter came out that was signed by hundreds of clinicians and researchers, scientists across the country, across the world, saying reusability is okay. Like, you know, we just follow these, you know, good hygiene practices, but, you know, it was really important to have those trusted voices to speak to all of us who were, you know, like I said, rightfully scared, companies who didn't want to get sued for allowing people to bring their own mugs or bring their own refillable things to the grocery stores or whatever. And so I think it's really important that, you know, not only do we have those voices kind of promoting what they know to be safe, but like you said, also within their own communities of, you know, changing the culture from within, which is hopefully what we can talk about today. And so for a local context, I want to welcome Ryan Weeks, who through his role in the Office of Sustainability is working directly with Hopkins Labs to identify and implement opportunities for waste diversion in more of a laboratory environment versus the clinical medical space.
All right. Yes, we have a couple slides here. Keep this going. All right. So these are also some resources here that Mariah put together. Step on that. So do that. So just take a look here. I don't know if you want to mention this really quickly, Mariah.
Sure. So Healthcare Without Harm also came up in the earlier session this morning. They are terrific. It's a worldwide, nationwide, also network of healthcare practitioners who are dedicated to every form of reducing harmful impacts of healthcare that you can think of. So they're state of the art. Please get in touch with them if you want to get involved. The Medical Society Consortium on Climate Health specializes in communicating with powerful people in the way that I was talking about. They are a great group to get involved with too. Climate for Health is a little more practically oriented. Greenhouse Lab at UCSF is starting to move laboratory waste management practices into the clinical setting, and they're reaching out for more involvement from everyone. And lastly, there's JG Sustainability with their colleagues here.
Awesome. Thank you. All right, so I'm just going to start here just so we can get a little bit of a say. Who is, just raise your hand, from like the university, sort of maybe a lab setting? Raise your hand. Okay, and then what do we have for like the health medicine side? Okay, all right. So we're going to force everyone to participate. So whether you're in a lab or not, or if you're in medicine or not, you're going to participate.
You're a patient somewhere.
So I need to push this down. All right. So I'm just going to give a little bit of context here about how much waste we're actually generating in our lab, in our hospital spaces. So we have here on the left, we're looking at our university side, and we obviously know that the university and the hospital are separate. So we also have our hospital side on the right. And looking at the university, we're generating approximately like 440 tons of biohazard waste every single year. You can see the breakdowns there where there's some from Homewood, some from the School of Public Health, majority coming from the School of Medicine, the School of Nursing. We also mentioned that we have 450 tons of animal bedding for all of those vivaria that we're supporting, and all of the waste that they're actually generating. So you see at the bottom, 45,000 biohazard boxes. That's so many biohazard boxes, right? Like if you're working in a lab, you're kind of thinking like, oh, I put it out and like my lab uses a couple a week or something like that. 45,000. That's so many.
Amazing that according to your numbers, the hospital uses less than a quarter.
Oh, well, we'll get there. All right. So this 9,500 biohazard boxes is just the pathological waste that's going out. All of that other 900 tons of general RMW, so regulated medical waste, that's not sort of listed as biohazard box. So, I mean, if we're trying to look at it, it's somewhere around 90,000 or something like that, right? If we're doing that math semi-correctly. So much waste, so much waste, right? Looking at the hospital, we're breaking that down. We have that 900 tons regulated medical waste, 90 tons of sharps. Think about sharps, like they're really not that heavy, right? So 90 tons of that, whoa. And then the pathological waste, really looking at that as well. So that's really related to that biohazard stuff. A lot of that could just be some plastics. Like when we're looking at lab waste, it's a lot of plastics. I mean, there's things like paper towels thrown in there. It's not super heavy stuff that's in there. So when we look at the volume of that, we're also looking at like, okay, so what is the volume? Like we don't track that. We don't know what that is, but it's quite a lot when we're seeing what that is. So let's go through and think about sort of reusing supplies versus diverting them, or what can we do, right? So just looking at a very blurry lab picture. Wow, it's not blurry on the screen. So what can we actually reuse regularly if we're looking at a lab and we go through, right? So this is something we want to think about and say, all right, well, do I buy it new every single time? Can I autoclave it? What are we looking at? Looking at reproducibility, efficacy, and safety. So really just trying to see all of those. Do I need to just buy it new every time and throw it away? Or is it something that I can sterilize, autoclave, clean, do whatever, right? So just looking at this picture, we can see three things. So looking at, does this work? Yeah. So looking just at the bottles here, we might say like, okay, is someone buying sterile water, right, that they're using, or can they autoclave it? So what's going on there? So maybe we can try autoclaving it. That's enough for their actual procedure. Maybe they do need to buy it perfectly new every time, and it's sterile and it's special and something like that, but maybe they don't have to. Looking at, we see a little serological pipetter here. Great use of, can we buy glass pipettes and sterilize them every time or clean them? Or do we have to buy the plastic ones that come individually wrapped every single time? Throw away the paper, throw away the plastic. What do we have to do there? And I also have sort of this gel box circled here. Looking at, you can buy gels that come in plastic wrap, every single one individual, or you can make them yourself. I've done it both ways. You can make them, with 2 glass slides, and you just reuse the same set of slides over and over and over again. What are your research needs? Can you actually do that, or do you need to be using new things every time? All right. There we go. Okay. So now we're looking at diversion, right? So looking at the same exact picture, what can we divert if we're in the lab? So what can we take and say we're going to recycle safely, or potentially compost maybe if we're looking at paper towels or something like that. But what can we do so that we're not putting everything in the biohazard box? And of course, here safety is our #1 priority. We want to make sure that we're keeping in mind the safety of our researchers, keeping in mind the safety of our material handlers, keeping in mind the safety of the people who are picking up our waste, where the waste is being incinerated or putting in a landfill. The safety of everyone is the utmost priority there. So we have to think about that as we go through the lab. So we can identify a couple things. So you can't really see it very well, but there's a bottle up here, a plastic bottle. So #1 and 2 plastics, if there's nothing in there that was hazardous, rinse it out. You can throw it into the recycling bin as long as it's been defaced. Up here, you can also not see that very well, but there's some cardboard boxes up there, just some boxes that some supplies came in. There's some paper, put it right into the recycling bin. There's really no issue why that can't be unless it's been contaminated somehow. We're here in the back, we see some plastic bags. So some campuses do film plastic recycling. So looking at these bags that just have microcentrifuge tubes or something in them, they're clean, put them right into the film plastic recycling instead. Pipette tip boxes here, you can see. So parts of Homewood and School of Medicine do pipette tip box recycling, as well as conical tube container recycling. And this is one way that like pipette tip boxes are pretty much never contaminated as long as they're outside of BSL2. You know, take those, collect them, bring them to a bin that's in your location. So we looked at some of our waste tonnage as we've gone through. Last year, we actually diverted 14 tons of pipette tip boxes, which is quite a lot when you think about that. Again, really light plastic. We were estimating like 100,000 pipette tip boxes or something like that. Very conservatively, if we use very, very high weights for that plastic. So that's a great amount. And we're starting to sort of make that dent in that lab waste. Small one, but still there. We also have styrofoam here. So some campuses can accept styrofoam as long as it's clean. That white, rigid styrofoam that comes from these conical tube racks, as well as like the coolers and stuff like that. And then finally, we have some nitrile gloves. Homewood, we do accept some nitrile gloves as long as they're clean. So looking at taking those things that we previously thought we couldn't do anything with, now recycling and turning into something else. All right, so this leads us to the question about looking at medical waste and how we can divert that. I am not a physician, so I don't really know what to do here, right? So that's what we're looking to talk about and how we can actually go through that. You know, if we're looking at the lab setting or the medicine setting, what can we do about that? All right.
Thanks, Ryan. I so appreciate Ryan and the work that we've been able to do together over the last year and a half, I guess. Because in some of my earlier days working with labs and working on grading labs, I barely stepped foot in a lab in college. I quickly removed myself from the biology major field. And so when I would go to labs to encourage them to adopt some of these practices, I was not an expert. I could not speak, you know, genuinely about like what is possible and speak the language. And so I think, again, speaking about, you know, with Mariah and Jeremy and Ryan, you know, it is, you know, we have to speak to our peers, and that's the only way I think we'll get, you know, anything, make change possible. Is it needs to be normed. And it can only be normed if your peers and socially it's something that, you know, kind of expected and accepted within those groups of people. So I'm excited to begin to kind of open this up. Before we open it up to all of you to sort of start to speak and reflect on what we've talked about, I just wanted to ask the three of you, how did we get here as a society? To the point where everything used to be sterilized and reused, to everything, almost everything, being disposable. And also, how did you get here? Jeremy, Mariah, Ryan, how did you end up in this space, really concerning yourself with sustainability, coming from, you know, a medical or research science career and you know, discipline? So I'll open it up to three of you, and then we'll talk to you. Jeremy.
Sure, I'm happy to start this. I might try and share my screen for just a second, just to show a couple of the slides that you're referencing before, Leana. And I don't know how much of these you can see. You can probably see some of my caption to myself as well. But you know, I you know, like Mariah, found myself not only upset and confused by the increasing vector of disposability that I was engaging with as a healthcare provider, but also as a historian, really puzzled by the fact that there were such robust spaces for reusability. And yet also some areas in which disposability is actually kind of important, and trying to tease them apart. So I actually began a research project that went back a bit to my own childhood. I grew up in New Jersey. And, you know, there's this whole New Jersey diaspora. A lot of people leave Jersey and find their way out, but this is a moment in August of 1987 in which the entire New Jersey shoreline was shut down because a wave of hospital trash basically, shut down 50 miles of shoreline. And some of you may remember this. It was called the Syringe Tide. And it happened one day. You basically, mostly with syringes, first hundreds of syringes, then thousands of syringes, all of these plastic syringes lining up on the beaches of New Jersey. And many of you who maybe don't remember that might know the Billy Joel song, "We Didn't Start the Fire," which, marches through the decades. And one of the 4 lines about the 1980s is hypodermics on the shore. So the state of New Jersey sued the state of New York. New York said, hey, those aren't our syringes. They blamed it on sort of junkies, drug users in New Jersey. New Jersey investigators said, hey, well, we're finding Staten Island addresses attached to these things in the prescriptions. Eventually, congressional hearings were held on the beach. And all of this, just to take a long story short, I mean, made for good headlines. There are these wonderful tabloids that emerged. There's following, it became national news, this lawsuit between New York and New Jersey. The echoes of sort of the hypodermic needles being kind of like shark's teeth of Jaws 2, which had only just recently been in theaters. But again, this threat that actually that was lurking in the 80s, right? That not only infectious hepatitis, but also, of course, what was then still called the AIDS virus rather than HIV, and a lot of concern that what were being considered as innocent children might step on a needle and find themselves exposed to hepatitis or to HIV/AIDS. And I'm bringing this up because it invokes a lot of these themes all at once. On the one hand, disposability was supposed to protect people against threats of contamination. The threat of contamination is behind a lot of this concern with disposability. Actually, sorry, hold on one second. Sorry about that. It is Baltimore City Public School spring break this week, and I have several teenagers in the room behind me right now. All I'm trying to say here is that there's a paradox that emerges here, which is that this movement that's supposed to actually produce safety actually produces greater harm. And one of the interesting things that emerges, and I'm not going to take you through all of my slides, the syringe tides did not easily, they returned the next summer even worse. They shut down really the entire mid-Atlantic shore for quite a while. And ultimately, this leads to a set of congressional hearings. It leads to, it leads to the federal definition of medical waste for the first time. And one of the interesting things that actually emerges in this space, here's Senator Bill Bradley for New Jersey, and here's the Medical Waste Tracking Act that emerges in 1988, and then there's the ocean waste dumping ban of 1989. So in some ways, medical waste is seen by environmental groups at the time as this boon which allows federal attention on the problem of dumping waste into the oceans. And so it's seen as here you see this quote here from the Daily News: "This medical waste has been a godsend." And yet, when you look at those who are who actually are poised to profit the most from this new sense that there's a special category of medical waste that needs to be treated really carefully on its own, it's actually this group of waste handlers who then basically say, listen, 20 years ago we didn't have this problem, right? It's the 80s. In the 60s, all the syringes were reusable. And so why is it that we're producing so much garbage? And we can treat this especially as medical waste. We'll charge you more for it. We'll make a lot of money, but shouldn't you maybe just think about actually reusing things more? And it's really interesting in these congressional hearings to find that the people most financially interested in processing this new market of waste that's now sanctioned, saying maybe we shouldn't be doing this. And so I've done a FOIA request, a Freedom of Information Act request with the U.S. Food and Drug Administration to actually look into the correspondences, that the government has had with this new single-use device industry, companies like Becton Dickinson, like 3M. And here's a Becton Dickinson ad from 1958. It says disposables or reusable. It says BD offers disposables or reusable. You can basically decide, do you want to use disposable syringes or reusable syringes? We make both of them. And so you have this hinge point in which clearly what happened is the entire apparatus of the of clinical medicine and of medical research went towards disposable, but it didn't need to. And we've been trying to re-examine why. What about the marketing of disposability resonated so much? And why is it that perhaps our fears, right, have actually taken up more space than our rational evaluation of what the true costs of this move actually are. I'm not suggesting that we need to do away with everything disposable in medicine, but that we haven't really taken a clear-eyed approach, and we know a lot more about the costs now. So this is partly where I'm coming at it from, and I think we're actually at a point where we can make a big difference.
I know. And I already shared what I had to say, so I'll save my time.
I can just add a little bit on where we got, sort of how we got here, sort of looking at that. And I think one of those things, I look at it from the lab space and looking at it and saying, we're looking at reusables versus single-use things in the lab, and I look at it and say, like, I remember Jeremy mentioned that one of our talks looking at that burden of sterility and who's actually doing all the sterilization. Is it the user themselves? Is it the university? What's happening there? Or is it you're just buying everything new and you throw it out and it's sterile, everything's good. I think really at some point in time there was that shift where people said, well, it's cheaper for me to buy it new than it is for me to spend the time to actually go and autoclave it or sterilize it. And just looking at like how we sort of got here, like three of us, whatever, I look at it as just like when I was working in the lab, I would sort of say things like, well, I could get this, reuse it, sterilize it all the time, but that's going to add hours to my day sometimes where I'm waiting for it. And when you're ready to go home, you're at the end of the day, you don't want to wait for something to sterilize for an hour. So you just get those things that you can just throw out, and then the next day they're all ready to go anyway. And I saw that it was just sort of like, I was a big offender of that. I didn't want to spend extra time working in the lab all the time. So just thought about it. I was like, wow, we really shouldn't be doing that. How can we change that? And how can we address it? So.
Thank you. So we have a lot of questions for you, the audience and the panelists. Okay, 10 minutes. Whoa. So let's open it up to all of you. If you have any burning questions for Jeremy or Mariah or Ryan, we'll ask them more questions, but then we really want to kind of put it out there for all of you to have a conversation amongst each other. Like, what are the structural barriers for you? What are the normative social barriers, cultural barriers within your spaces? Because sometimes those are even more difficult to overcome than the structural barriers. So we'll open it up to one or two questions real quick for the panelists and then have a discussion. Yeah.
This is more of a comment on how we got here. I'm part of the laboratory safety advocates group, and part of the issue is why the Homewood campus is here is because there is one common stream for potentially biohazard waste and chemical waste. I would estimate of what's in a biohazard box from the Homewood campus, less than 10% of it is truly a biohazard. The rest is chemical hazard. And the institution made a decision before I got here is if it's going to have gloves in it, which appear to be medical gloves, or there are going to be syringes, or there are going to be pipettes that could be interpreted as medical waste, even if they were only used in a chemical application. We're going to put it all in the biohazard box and dispose of it that way because we do not want the potential lawsuits that come out. I am a very big advocate. We need to segregate the waste that comes out of our research labs in a way that says what's truly a biohazard, what is a potentially chemical hazard, and what is normal lab, what I would call normal lab waste. A paper towel that was used to wipe off the surface, unless it was actually soaked in a hazardous chemical or used for a biological sample, that should be thrown in a trash can. Just as if you cut your finger in the lab, where does the paper go? Except in the lab here, where does the paper, or if you're outside of the lab, where does the paper towel go? goes into the trash can. It doesn't go into a biohazard box. So that's where we are, and how do we get here? How to, for lack of a better term, the boots on the ground, those people who work in labs on a daily basis. I'm willing to do this. I know it's important, and I'm going to be part of the mechanism to move it forward. So
I think we look at one of our big structural barriers.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, so the first key structural barrier here at Hopkins is our own policy. And, you know, for whatever reason that policy was created, that's what we are living with right now. And so, you know, what are the mechanisms for addressing that structural policy? Like how, you know, no matter what we wanted to do individually within our labs, you know, you guys are all limited by what's allowed from HSE or whatever other institutional policies. You know, our colleagues, when we talk to other sustainability and green labs folks, they're like, you do what? You only have biohazard boxes in your lab? What? So,
the question came up on the chat.
well,
For that.
Okay. So how do we address that? Because we can't get beyond anything until we have that structural barrier decreased. So anybody have any thoughts on how do we, as sustainability advocates, as lab researchers, as folks in the medical field, how do we begin to address that structural barrier?
And for the person who asked the question in the chat, we have noticed the question, we will get to it. Thank you.
I'm answering you on Slack.
Have any of you within your spaces brought this up to your PIs or to your fellow, you know, researchers or clinicians or whomever? Like, why do we do things this way?
Sorry, I gotta go. Yeah, that's.
Oh, thank you.
Remember I said this was interactive. Yes, thank you.
I'm actually a physician by training from India. So the whole like reuse of like disposable speculum and all of that, like disposable pipettes, like I'm really not familiar with, because like we autoclave everything. Like in my hospital and like the several hospitals I worked at, we have always used reusable speculums. There would be like trays of fresh like sterilized speculums like that would be brought to the OPDs, and like they would just get replaced as they were getting used. So that's why like, it is possible. I know it's possible because like if I can work in like a garment setup in India on with like reusable equipment, then I can easily do the same thing here. It's just like people like convenience, like you mentioned. So yeah, it's just like a little bit of extra effort, I think, but it can be done.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead.
I had a somewhat unrelated question for Chairman Greene, which is in a historical context. How does the rise of the use of medical applications, research applications, mirror the wider societal plastic use? Because we become a disposable plastic society. And I think that the saying here highlights that you have all new paths to go down, right? But we decided to go down a plastics path as we have as we're society. And so what, and then that gets to the point that I'm making, why do you want to stay around? How do you get back? How do you build infrastructure to get back to a sustainable set of materials?
Thank you. Jeremy, did you hear that?
I heard most of it. I think one of the challenges of Zoom is the microphone, but I understand the question to be asking both. You know, how does this relate to the more general rise of throwaway culture in American society on the one hand, right? And also the sort of heterogeneity of use, reuse in different parts of the world that the last speaker also referred to. And how do we look, for example, in the Indian context in which, you know, reuse is a more normative practice, perhaps in sites of medical training than here, than in Baltimore. So to take both of these on, I think it's essential, right? And on the one hand, you know, we might look at a work like Susan Strasser's book, Waste and what's it called? Waste and Want, a history of basically American, you know, throwaway culture, right? And certainly this transformation occurs, you know, within the medical world in a similar time frame as within, say, McDonald's, and learning to, you know, throw away, you know, plates or take away coffee cups and these sorts of things. But I think there's a set of special arguments that are made within medical culture that help to perpetuate it, such that when so many other sectors of the economy have in recent years been moving away from disposability or understanding elements of sustainable and greening, healthcare, especially in this recent pandemic, has just dug in and amplified, right? So it's actually a divergence. So, but it's helpful to look together, because one of the things you learn from the history of the movement away from a circular economy towards the linear economy in the mid 20th century in general American society is that actually a lot of people resisted it, right? There are many people for whom this transformation was not good. And if you look within medicine, the same is true, right? Like, for example, the disposable suture removal kit that I need to use in my clinic now has forceps that are inferior because they're made of plastic, right? And actually, the physicians in our clinic protested against this, and we've had them replaced with reusable forceps now. So there's ways in which actually understanding prior movements of resistance can actually give pathways for future ones. But to get back to the other dimension of this question, which is, how do we understand you know, it's one thing to have never gone down a path. It's another thing to try and go back down a path. And as a historian, I don't want to confuse history with nostalgia and say we just need to get back where we were, right? But at the same time, you know, the things that have happened in the meantime. So, you know, I think it helps to make it not an all or nothing response. So, for example, if we talk with infectious disease control epidemiologists at healthcare, at hospitals, and we've just begun these conversations, you know, if we were to go say, hey, you all should do nothing disposable at all, we'll just get laughed at. But if we open up a conversation and say, well, what are the objects that you think are really crucial to have, make sure you have a new one every time? And what are the things in which we're just unthinkingly applying a policy, right? Where reusability really is not a problem. We actually have a really productive site of conversation in which we begin to think about certain devices, you know, like scissors, for example, where there's really no good need, no good reason not to autoclave them, right? And people can get behind this. So, and if we look in another space, in the space of pulmonology, you know, Mariah and I have been having a lot of conversations about this, that, you know, for example, the making of green inhalers, right, which have less carbon, you know, emissions, right? We've been there before, in that we already shifted away from inhalers that were that didn't have chlorofluorocarbons, so as not to, you know, open up the ozone hole. But we also, as Mariah pointed out, when we made that shift, we put the burden of paying for this on people who have asthma, which we know is a disease that's geographically associated with areas of urban poverty, right? So we've actually put the burden of greening on those who have the least ability to pay. So how do we actually look at this a different way when we try and reimagine green therapeutics, right? But also, what do we do in the world of pulmonology, where pulmonologists, perhaps more than any other specialty, are seeing the effects of climate change directly on health? I mean, we just take a look at, you know, our partners in community activist groups in South Baltimore and Curtis Bay, who are, you know, protesting their proximity to incinerators and waste handling, and also noting the high rates of pulmonary conditions in this neighborhood, right? So pulmonologists are very much tuned into this space. And yet at the same time, pulmonologists are also attuned to a possible difference if it's perceived that an inhaler doesn't work as well on a given person with COPD or asthma. And so getting into this thing and saying, hey, it's not an all or nothing of use the greener thing or use something that's less effective, but who are the people for whom you know, staying on the old inhaler is maybe more important? And who are the people for whom actually the switch causes no consequence? So we're trying to open up these spaces in which we can't do away with the conversations about safety and efficacy that have emerged in the disposable space, but we can actually move past this Manichaean way in which it's all or nothing and try and actually have productive conversation. That was a long response. I'm sorry, I'm a historian. We tend to speak in paragraphs.
It's okay, Jeremy. I think you did a fantastic job of sort of like summarizing where we need to go. And so we are at time, and that flew by. We thought we'd be talking for forever. But I think that, you know, sort of like as you leave this space today, I think take this sort of thoughts with you. Is that one, it's not all or nothing. You know, everybody interacts, whether you're in a lab or whether you're in a clinic or wherever you are in your office, wherever it may be. There are opportunities to start to make those changes and to have those conversations. I think that's the second really important part, is that we are starting these conversations in these spaces that were so sacrosanct. Like you couldn't touch a lab, you can't touch, you know, an ER or an OR or, you know, a patient's room. Like, well, you know what, actually there are some spaces where with, you know, with good research and with good, you know, conversations and with safety, you know, conversations and others, we can start to see where this is possible, and it is not all or nothing. There are some things that we probably need to keep the way they are, but it doesn't mean that it has to, you know, be just like in our lab spaces where it's all biohazard, because we know for a fact that it actually is not. So I encourage you to continue these conversations in your spaces and continue those conversations with us, so that we can keep this going and look for those opportunities where reuse is possible. So I thank you all for joining us today.
And where should James L go to make progress? James L is ready to act, and like there's a limitation.
I know who James is, but someone in James's situation can come to me.
Thank you, everybody in the chat, James, Christine, Nessa, everyone. Cheers.
All right.